All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, I'm kind of stepping into the role of your enthusiastic history professor, because we're diving into an absolute masterclass on one of the most stunning, chaotic, and frankly, embarrassing moments in American military history, the Battle of Bladensburg. Grab your notebooks, because this is going to be a wild ride. Picture this. It's August 1814. The United States Capitol is literally on fire. The American army has just run away from the battlefield so incredibly fast that British observers mockingly called their retreat a race. Yet, somehow, out of the ashes of this complete and utter disaster, a stronger, more unified nation actually emerged. So how on earth did a humiliating military rout and a burning capital forge a unified nationalistic America? Well, that's the fascinating paradox we're going to unravel today. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our syllabus for today. We're going to start with the paradox of defeat, then look at the clashing leadership and tactics. Next, we'll compare the militia's flight with the Navy's stand, follow the British to the capital in flames, and finally, break down the political fallout and that surge in nationalism. All right, Section 1, the paradox of defeat. Let's set the stage. To really get why this battle went so wrong, we have to look at who was actually in charge. And wow, the contrast in leadership here is staggering. On the British side, you've got Major General Robert Ross. He's leading about 4,500 battle-hardened veterans straight out of the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, these guys are disciplined, they're professional, and against him, American Brigadier General William H. Winder. Winder was, well, an indecisive political appointee. Sure, he's commanding a numerically superior force of about 6,500 men, but the vast majority of them are completely untested, poorly equipped state militia. Winder actually had a track record of surrendering detachments, but he got this vital command mostly because of his political connections in Washington. So right from the jump, it's a massive, fundamental mismatch. Moving into Section 2, clashing leadership and tactics. Let's head down to the battlefield and look at the strategy, or, the lack thereof. So, Winder's defensive plan was totally fragmented. He left his men in these three disjointed lines across the Anacostia River without any coherent retreat protocol. But to be fair, he was also absolutely crippled by disastrous civilian interference. Secretary of War John Armstrong had woefully neglected preparations because he was convinced, wrongly of course, that the British just wouldn't target Washington. And, incredibly, President James Madison and Secretary of State James Monroe were physically out there on the battlefield. Monroe was even moving troops around personally without Winder's authority. Talk about dangerously blurring the chain of command right as the enemy approaches. So the crucial point here is that the British easily dismantled those fragmented American lines using sheer tactical dominance. Ross's 4,500 Peninsular War veterans didn't just march blindly into a wall of fire. Instead, they used highly disciplined bayonet charges, and they executed these brilliant upstream flanking maneuvers across the river to just completely envelop the American left flank. But it wasn't just physical force. They combined all of that with some devastating psychological warfare. And that psychological warfare, it came in the form of Congreve rockets. These were early artillery weapons that shot these fiery trails through the air with a terrifying, screeching noise and totally unpredictable trajectories. Now, they didn't actually cause massive physical casualties, but, just put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine being an untrained farmer in the militia who has literally never seen combat. Suddenly, you're facing screaming, exploding rockets raining down from the sky. The sheer novelty and terror of these weapons absolutely shattered the American militia's morale before the British bayonets even got close. All right, Section 3, militia flight versus naval stand. This is where we hit the central focus of our analysis, the wildly divergent performances of the American forces. Now, what's really interesting here is the sharp side-by-side contrast. On one hand, you have 6,000 local militia citizens. They're poorly disciplined, and they practically disintegrated under that rocket fire. They fled so fast and so chaotically that British observers actually made fun of them, calling the retreat the Bladensburg Races. But on the other hand, you had the U.S. naval contingent. These guys were combat-seasoned, highly disciplined, and they stubbornly held the line, inflicting disproportionate and really heavy casualties on the British attackers. 500. That's the crucial number to remember here. It was merely 500 men under Commodore Joshua Barney, including sailors from his recently scuttled Chesapeake flotilla, who provided the only real, sustained opposition of the entire day. They formed a disciplined infantry square back in the 3rd Defensive Line, manned heavy cannons, and repelled multiple British assaults. These 500 guys delayed the British advance for over an hour, buying precious time for the capital to evacuate, and they only retreated when they literally ran out of ammunition and Barney himself was severely wounded. To humanize this a bit, let's look at Charles Ball. He was an escaped enslaved man from Maryland who fought bravely as a seaman in Barney's integrated flotilla. In his memoirs, he lamented the militia's flight, saying, "If the militia regiments that lay on our right and left had stood as we did, we would have beat the British." Barney's command included free African Americans and escaped enslaved men who fought so tenaciously they earned the deep respect of the British officers. Officers who actually noted they were the only Americans on the field who stood firm. Moving on to Section 4, the Capitol in flames. Because the militia collapsed so quickly, the road to the Capitol was left completely, terrifyingly wide open. Let's quickly walk through this rapid timeline. The battle starts at noon on August 24th. By 8 p.m., British forces, largely unopposed, march right into Washington, D.C. In retaliation for American actions in Canada, they systematically start burning public buildings: the Capitol, the Library of Congress, the White House, the whole shebang. But look at the morning of August 25th. A violent thunderstorm, possibly a hurricane combined with a tornado, strikes the city out of nowhere. People actually remember it as the storm that saved Washington because it extinguished the flames, killed several British troops, and ultimately forced their total withdrawal. Now, right before those fires were set, there was a frantic evacuation of the executive residence. We have this incredibly vivid eyewitness account from Paul Jennings, a 15-year-old enslaved attendant to President Madison. He recalls how the French doorkeeper and the gardener hastily removed the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington under First Lady Dolly Madison's strict orders. Jennings also adds this surreal, almost unbelievable detail. When the British did arrive, they ate up the very dinner I had prepared. Yeah, the British soldiers literally sat down at the president's table, ate a warm feast prepared for 40 guests, drank the Madison's wine, and then piled the furniture high and burned the house to the ground. Let's move to Section 5, political fallout and nationalism. We're going to zoom out now and see how this builds into our macro-level analysis of the battle's aftermath. The sheer humiliation of the Bladensburg rout was a harsh, undeniable lesson for the country. It brutally exposed the founding American myth that ad hoc citizen militias could reliably defend the Republic against professional, veteran armies. The government was forced to adapt. By passing the Act of March 3, 1815, the U.S. fundamentally shifted its military structure. They finally abandoned that total reliance on militias in favor of establishing a standing, professional army of 10,000 well-drilled regulars. And this brings us to the ultimate political paradox of the defeat. Yes, Secretary of War John Armstrong was forced to resign in total disgrace. But ironically, the disaster didn't break the ruling Republican Party. Instead, the anti-war Federalist Party held the Hartford Convention to air their grievances. And wow, the timing was just disastrous for them. It made them look completely unpatriotic, borderline treasonous, really, when news of peace and Andrew Jackson's stunning victory at New Orleans arrived soon after. The Republicans masterfully spun the narrative, completely discredited the Federalists, and ushered in the era of good feelings, an era totally defined by a unified, militaristic American nationalism. Which brings us back to our final lingering paradox. How did a burning capital and a fleeing army lead to a stronger, more united America? Well, the ashes of Washington effectively fertilized a brand new national identity. The trauma forced the United States to abandon its naive reliance on untrained militias, to build a real professional army, and ultimately to unite politically against a common foe. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. Why does a nation sometimes require the absolute humiliation of defeat to forge its most enduring political strength? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the history you think you know, and I'll see you next time.